There is no law of war that says you're allowed to start a war and then complain when you lose it. Tell your bosses in Qatar to tell their friends in Gaza to stop the war and give back the hostages. History shows only one people will protect the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That's what Zionism is. I don't know, maybe, have you ever been there?
Yes.
When?
A few years ago, not recently. I don't get awards from the president of Israel like you do, so I don't get to do softball interviews with Netanyahu. I didn't get invited into Gaza. Douglas,
let me finish my point.
But you went to Gaza, right? You said you went to Gaza. How come you went to Gaza when the world's media is not allowed into Gaza?
There's two reasons.
But they took you into Gaza.
Well, first of all, I'll explain, but let me pick up my point since you keep trying to derail me. There are two ways to go into Gaza. One is with the IDF, which is what I did and what most Western journalists have done. The other is to go in with Hamas. You could probably go in with Hamas. I can't.
You are going to the most fierce debate yet. Watch Douglas destroys Mehdi Hasan in anti-Israel rights. It was on 19th of June, the stage was all set. The Monk debate hosted in debate where a clash of titans shook the intellectual world. Douglas Murray, the spectacular, renowned for his sharp wit, and Mehdi Hasan faced off in a heated debate. Stay tuned as we delve into the fiery exchanges, the arguments that hit home, and the aftermath that has everyone talking. So, the debate's motion was be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and Douglas was in motion along with Natasha Hausdorff and Mehdi Hasan, with Gideon Levy was in motion. The debate started with opening statements, and now, watch out for Douglas Spectacular's opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Rudyard. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Monk debates. When I was last here a couple of years ago, I just returned from the front line of the war in Ukraine, where I was with the Ukrainian armed forces. And for most of the last 8 months, I've been in Israel and Gaza, following the war there as closely as I can. And I won't go into all the details now that I could give you of what's happening. But I would just put it in perspective in this way.
Then he condemns the horrifying incident on the 7th of October, and those who need to hear it aloud. On October 7th, there was a terrorist attack took place in a crowded area of Tel Aviv and shook innocent lives that suffered in a senseless act of violence.
First of all, what happened on the 7th of October was not just a massive attack on innocent people inside Israel. It was the equivalent to about 6,000 Canadians being massacred and burned in their homes in one day. It was the equivalent of about 1,500 of your fellow Canadians being taken hostage.
Now put attention to this part as he started with some brutal and important question that every one of us should ponder on. It is serious.
You know, you would have thought after an attack like the one that Hamas instigated, that started this terrible war, you would have thought that there would be some sympathy for the world, from the world. You might have thought the world would pay attention to the attack and at least pay attention to the people behind it. You might have expected, like me, that there might have been a worldwide opposition to the terrorists and rapists and murderers of Hamas. You might have thought there would be hatred around the world erupting at the government of Qatar and its mouthpiece, Al Jazeera, its funding of Hamas and its hosting of the leadership of Hamas in Qatar. You might have thought there'd have been an outpouring of rage at the Islamic Revolutionary Government in Tehran.
And we all have to understand how abruptly he not only emphasizes the lack of global outrage, but also questions the double standards applied when other nations face similar tragedies and wait something more yet to come.
But no, there was an immediate outpouring of rage against the state that had been attacked. Bring back our girls, we had 10 years ago in the war in northern Nigeria, which I also covered. Bring back our girls. No international campaign saying bring back our Jewish children. Believe all women, we've been told for years. But turns out, not if the raped women are Jews.
Back to Douglas in a sec, as he further exposes the hypocrisy in global activism by clearly pointing out selective outrage and neglect of Jewish victims. I demand why there is silence among all global organization that stands for women, and now, along with him, we all should ask, Where are global campaigns like those for kidnapped Nigerian girls, Bring Back Our Girls, with a similar outcry for kidnapped Jewish children? And it could stop him here. He further brings the brutal yet undeniable truth. Let's hear some.
Israel is the only country in the world which, when it's attacked, gets attacked more. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is, as my late friend Jonathan Sachs said, it's a shape-shifting virus.
Let's go back to Douglas as he confronts the elephant in the room.
When you could hate people for their religion, the Jews were hated for their religion. Then you couldn't hate people for that anymore, so people hated the Jews for their race. And then after the 20th century, people realized that wasn't such a great idea either. Now, the Jews are hated not for their religion or their race, but for having a state.
And then further challenges the audience to confront the stark reality of anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism.
Zionism, as we just heard, is simply the right of the Jews to self-determination in their historic homeland. That's all. Anti-Semitism, as we've also just heard, is double standards against Jewish people or cruel and unfair treatment of people because they're Jews. This isn't very far away from home here. If this isn't anti-Semitism, can the audience here tell me why the following things have happened since October the 7th? Why in a Montreal suburb a synagogue should be firebombed, as happened in November? Why there should have been gunshots against the yeshiva? Why in Toronto a bookstore owned by a Jew should be attacked? Why a Molotov cocktail was thrown through a Jewish community center in Montreal? Why a Toronto Jewish deli in North York was firebombed? Why in Toronto the Orthodox synagogue was vandalized? Why in Toronto 2 men opened fire the other week on a Jewish girls' school?
He asks if these actions aren't anti-Semitism, then what else could explain them? Then he ended speech with something everyone needs to hear.
And one question hovers over it above all. The question of who would protect the Jews. Who would you trust to protect them? The Europeans? The Arab world? No. History shows only one people will protect the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That's what Zionism is.
Now let's tune into the next segment where the debaters had to respond, taking the discussion to a roaring crescendo. And watch Douglas destroys Mehdi.
Let me first say, Gideon, you started with a peroration about me not mentioning the Palestinian casualties. That's because I started by mentioning the war, and there is no law of war that says you're allowed to start a war and then complain when you lose it. And if Mehdi cares about the Palestinian casualties, as I'm sure he does, then tell your bosses in Qatar to tell their friends in Gaza to stop the war and give back the hostages.
Douglas is absolutely right here. He hits the nail on the head by former, and it's like throwing a stone and hiding your hand. It is like you can't start a fire and then complain about getting burned. And latter, Murray calls a spade a spade. He lays bare the hypocrisy of criticizing Israel while ignoring the provocations by entities like Qatar and Hamas. It's high time we call out these double standards and demand accountability across the board. Murray hits the bullseye again.
And I would just add one other thing. I know that the media has tried to reframe the motion. I'm not going to allow it either. You know, maybe there is somebody in the world. Pakistan was invented, created as a state around the same time as Israel. I reckon that if this debate tonight was about Pakistan, Pakistan started a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of casualties, caused a lot of casualties. But you know what? If somebody said, I think Pakistan should be abolished. They just don't have the right to a state, and although they had one set up for them many decades ago, we should abolish it. I think people would say, And then if the person said, but, oh, by the way, although I want to abolish that state, I have no problem with the Pakistani people. Please, of course you would.
This analogy is a masterstroke. Comparing Israel's right to exist with Pakistan's shows the absurdity and prejudice of denying Israel's legitimacy while accepting the sovereignty of other nations, thereby challenge the double standards applied to Israel for the people like Mehdi. And now wait for Mehdi Hasan.
Douglas stepped up and accused every Jewish protester against Israel of being an anti-Semite, which I find offensive and ridiculous. Thousands upon thousands of Jews. You don't have to agree with them, remember. You don't have to agree with them. But they took their right to go out on the streets in Toronto, in DC, in New York, in London, in Paris, all over the world, in Tel Aviv, to protest against what's happening in Gaza. And Douglas, one of the world's most proud atheists, not Jewish as far as I know, just damned them all as anti-Semites. Wow, that speaks volumes about where this debate is going and who is defining what and how.
Now watch how Hasan twists Murray's words. And let me clear this: Murray never branded all Jewish protesters as anti-Semites. He pointed out that protests solely targeting Israel, while ignoring greater atrocities, reveal anti-Semitic undertones. It's a classic case of putting words in someone's mouth. Mehdi Hasan,
who is Jewish, just so Douglas will call him an anti-Semite later, as he pointed out, the Basques, the Catalans, the Kurds, the Scots, they don't have states. And if you oppose them having states, you're not an anti-Kurd bigot, you're not an anti-Scot bigot, you're not an anti-Catalan bigot. People have arguments all the time. There are 5,000 indigenous groups in the world today. According to the UN, there are 193 member states of the UN. You do the math, right? So this is ridiculous, this argument that we are being expected to believe that if you don't support Israel as it is currently constituted, with Jewish supremacy, as Gideon points out,
well, Mehdi Hasan, you misses the boat. If you say this, you must have not know Jewish and need to read some history, sir, as the Jewish struggle is unique. It is rooted in survival, not just nationalism. And note that Murray's argument about double standards precisely addresses this context. Mehdi Hasan. It's an abuse of anti-Semitism to defend a country that has killed tens of thousands of innocent people in recent months.
It empties at a very important concept, at a very urgent time of all meaning, in order to defend a country which, as Gideon has pointed out, and which Douglas seems to think is fine, has killed tens of thousands of innocent people in recent months.
And here Hasan's framing is skewed. He conveniently omits the provocations and existential threats Israel faces. Murray's stance isn't about excusing wrongful actions, but recognizing that anti-Zionism often serves as a cloak for anti-Semitism. And now watch Douglas being more ruthless and honest.
I don't know, maybe. Have you ever been there?
Yes.
When?
A few years ago, not recently. I don't get awards from the president of Israel like you do, so I don't get to do softball interviews.
Well, you should.
I didn't get invited into Gaza.
If I were you,
Douglas, you said in your
let me finish my point.
But you went to Gaza, right? You said you went to Gaza. How come you went to Gaza when the world's media is not allowed into Gaza?
There's two reasons.
But they took you into Gaza.
Now, Mehdi really think he silenced Douglas. Wait for Douglas' intellectual response.
Well, first of all, I'll explain, but let me pick up my point since you keep trying to derail me. There are two ways to go into Gaza. One is with the IDF, which is what I did and what most Western journalists have done. The other is to go in with Hamas. You could probably go in with Hamas. I can't. Secondly, so if I was on stage tonight busily flying around the world to busily defame a democracy, I would spend a bit of time there, Mehdi. I would spend a bit of time there because everything you said about it, like Gideon, is totally untrue.
Now let's get back to Douglas, what he has to say in his closing statement.
Well, thank you very much. Quite a lot of heat, some light. We set out this evening defining what both these terms were, and they are defined for you. Anti-Semitism. Cruel treatment, double standards applied to Jews. Anti-Zionism is a movement that believes that the Jews don't have the right to a state in their historic homeland.
Douglas begins by clearly defining both terms and hereby shuts all the discussion given by the opposition and teaches double standards applied to Jews, as he suggests that the unique scrutiny and criticism faced by Israel are manifestations of anti-Semitic attitudes. And then he hits the nail.
And as I said at the beginning, anti-Semitism is a shapeshifter. It does come from all sorts of directions, and Mehdi is right. As I mentioned at the beginning, it can come from the far right, it can come from the far left. But at the moment, what we see an eruption of is anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism. What else is it that is motivating the crowds? Why, when I was in Vancouver the other month, were there crowds going down the street in Vancouver screaming about Israel? What's it got to do with them? You're miles away. It's got absolutely into the brains of people in the West who believe they're doing something moral, and they are imbibing every anti-Semitic trope, as Natasha has proven.
Back to Douglas in a sec, so Here Douglas accurately identifies that anti-Semitism often masquerades as anti-Zionism, which, revealing the underlying prejudice driving much of the anti-Zionist rhetoric and his rhetorical question, brilliantly exposes the irrationality and incongruity of anti-Zionist protests far removed from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. By questioning why people in Vancouver are so vehemently anti-Israel, he highlights how deeply entrenched and widespread this bias has become, often disconnected from any direct impact or understanding. And now see Douglas being brutal, and believe me, he doesn't pull any punches here.
I should say, since Mehdi was honest, I'll say what I think. I think he's a very dishonest actor. A very dishonest actor. And to say what you just said about hostages would come a lot better if a contributor to Al Jazeera had not been discovered last week holding a hostage in his home. It would be a lot easier to take. And finally, I just want to say this. It's perfectly obvious, I said at the beginning, that you can get anti-Semitism from all directions. This just happens to be the major direction which is coming in at the moment, in the guise of anti-Zionism.
Douglas destroys Mehdi Hasan, labeling him as a very dishonest actor. And he not only mince words here, as he clearly refer why he said this as refer incidents involving Al Jazeera contributors, thereby undermining Hasan's arguments and credibility in the debate. And those who don't know, as per sources, Mehdi Hasan began his career working for Al Jazeera. But a few years ago, MSNBC gave him a show. It had some of the lowest ratings even on MSNBC. And after 7th of October, even they had enough of him became even more so, which may be one reason why he has now had to return to Al Jazeera. And then aptly points out the very important point.
As I said, does everybody who is doing this know what they're doing? No. Almost certainly not. To some of them, oh, you bet. They're having a whale of a time. People like those people I mentioned marching last week through Jewish areas of Toronto, getting to scream about the pigs and the rats again. Wow, it feels good to them. Does everyone know what they're doing? No.
And now let me tell you how much we all have to think over this, as he vividly describes anti-Zionists marching through Jewish neighborhoods and using vile rhetoric, vividly showing the hateful nature of these actions. And a word to the wise is sufficient when he points out who got pleasure from such incidents. And now see Douglas utterly destroy the second opponent, Gideon.
But when you hear Gideon saying that, what did you say earlier? That Israel is the most brutal regime in the world, you can have traveled nowhere, sir.
And wait till the end when Douglas drops the bombshell on this.
And there is no reason, as I said at the beginning of this tonight, why simply recognizing that the anti-Zionism of today is anti-Semitism should be any barrier to there being some kind of peace settlement at some point. But please understand that those of us who recognize that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is because we see, after a mass slaughter of Jews, the world turning on the one Jewish state. That is what we see and what we worry about, and what some people like Mehdi seem not to care about, and all of the smears and all of the lies that they get to pump out.
Then he continues to hammer home the truth.
But I've got good news for you, ladies and gentlemen, to finish. I hope very much that you vote the right way tonight, obviously. And it matters for Canada and its image. But the Jewish state and the Jewish people have survived an awful lot worse than this. They have seen off every single one of their enemies, from Pharaoh to the Abyssinians, to the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans. They will see off Hamas, they will see off Mehdi, and they will outlive everybody in this room.
For a great debate.
Now, how remarkable, Douglas, a spectacular one. And I want all to listen. This Jerusalem has been attacked 52 times, captured and recaptured 44 times, besieged 23 times, and destroyed twice. Not only this, Israel has fought in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, But Israel has also fought the Palestinian Fedayeen insurgency, Suez Crisis, Six-Day War, War of Attrition, Yom Kippur War, and the list will not stop. And you will agree with me, what Israel saw is just the deluge of slaughter upon the Jews. And let's ask people like Mehdi Hasan, do you think that the record of history shows that the Jews are safe when they don't have their own state? Obviously, the answer is no. So then what is your proposition to protect the Jews? And you, Mehdi Hasan, you have no answer saying that Jewish can have a one state. And more for all that's not Jewish in the land of Israel, given the history of the Jews, not just treated in the diaspora of Europe, but in the Arab world. Study the history of the rapes, the pogroms, the murders that occurred in the Arab world in Israel prior to Israel's existence. It is a farce to say, I am all in favor of the Jews and against anti-Semitism. But they can't have their own state in their historic homeland. It's a wrong statement. And that really exclaims that you have no regard whatsoever for the Jewish peoples. Well, that's it. And if you want to see more, Douglas shuts Mehdi Hasan again. Do watch our last video. I am sure you all don't want to miss that.